Hello and welcome to day 2 of Divine Intervention, 365 Days of World Building. Today we're going to talk about the magic of divine intervention, as a lot of the following couple weeks of information, it's going to require like an understanding of the magic. Not so much an understanding, but it helps to see where everything else is coming from if you understand how the magic works. Tome, an explorer from the 1800s, said it the best. Magic is the missing link between faith and science. And most of the time it takes a little bit of both to execute properly. In divine intervention, magic is called Vesper. Essence of Vesper. And Vesper is something that surrounds everything, is everything around everything in the world. And it's almost more of a radiation than it would be like, say, a life force or like some sort of small animal or critter that lives in your blood. Not that that's canon anymore, but it's definitely more of a radiation and in this essence that lives within the world itself. And it's more of a spectrum of an essence. So there's different types of Vespers, and they all have different qualities to them, and they all kind of congregate differently too. Basically in the world, the way this works in the world is the Vesper kind of go and surround things that are like the Vesper that you're looking at. You have different states of Vespers. Vesper essence condensed with faith. So where you have people who are worshiping, or you have life, or just the environment that Vesper like clings to, it's going to condense around that area. And as it condenses around that, the magic of the Vesper increases. What will happen is the more Vesper that congregates into an area, you'll get these Vesper crystals, which are basically like a condensed, solidified version of Vesper. And these crystals are used in a lot of like magic spells. Some nations wear them in necklaces. Some of them attach it to like weapons. Some of the nations don't use them at all for their god. Let's see. I have this. So this is kind of like an idea of what I'm talking about. So on the yellow end, where you have these guys, the czars, or the tribes of the valley, you have more of like a low density, chaotic Vesper. And so that spectrum down of the Vesper essences, it's chaotic. It breathes in chaotic like environments. The tribes of the valley, they're nomads. They're always on hunt. They're always out on patrol. They're always killing. A main part of their society focuses on like blood sacrifice. So, and it's more just like, it's like I said, it's blood sacrifice. It's more of like a death kind of religion. They worship the god Czars, which is this giant two-headed worm thing, which we'll get into later on in the week on the Czars Day. But they are chaotic people. They're almost primitive. They're like one of the more primitive types of nation that they have. And that's why they flock to that yellow spectrum of the Vespers, because they both kind of come together under the same ideology. It's important to note, and I'll probably say this like a bunch of times throughout the year, but the nations aren't made from like races or nationalities or anything like that. They're worshippers of the god and the Vespers that go with that god. So if you're somebody who really likes adventure and you grow up in an astral nation, which is all like knowledge based and learning, and you know, like lots of libraries and stuff like that, you probably gonna get on a boat and go up to like the Wanderers of the Unseen Nation and check them out. Same thing goes where like if you were from the Hoarfrost Nation and everyone up there is kind of like, they keep to themselves, they're very stubborn, they like have high endurance, they like just living in the cold, they like having that like knowledge that they live in the harshest environment and they just, you know, it makes them better than everybody else. And let's say you're more of like somebody who like flourishes in life, and loves animals and things like that, and you have an affinity, for plants, you might just head down to the Everfolk. It's not uncommon in the time frame that we're going to be talking about for the most part in Divine Intervention. So back on that same idea, you have these 6 different nations that come together on these Vespers, and each god is like the epitome or like the symbol for that like Vesper essence. But at the same time, it's you should always remember that it's a spectrum. Like this was more of a graph to kind of illustrate the densities of it. So like you have on the left side chaotic, and you have that yellow and death, and those Vespers are always energized in the air and they're always moving, and it's got a low density. So there's magic, but there's not too much magic. You rarely see like yellow crystals in Divine Intervention. You'd see them in places of like extreme worship, where like Czar's Cavern is the home of Czars, and they like feed him and take care of him and do a lot of like daily sacrifices to him there, and you'll see like yellow Vesper crystals solidify there because that's like the central focal point of their worship. But you're not really going to see them too much out here because they're always on the move. They're never in one spot. They flow with the essence of the Vesper, and they're always on the move, and that's like the idea of it. Where the endurance on like this other side, where you have like high density of the Vesper essence, it's more like a systematic nature of the people that like worship those. You'll have tons of Vesper crystals in there. The Hoarfrost Nation, you'll find veins of white, gray Vesper crystals all throughout the mountains. They'll be mined for lots of different things. They're very much solidified and a lot like the stone and the snow magic of like the white Vesper and the Fajit. So instead of like, say this culture, the tribes of the valley, where they're always on the move, in the Hoarfrost Nation, they settle down. They don't move too much. Their whole like mentality of being a person is being like self-reliant, never moving. Like that's their big thing is endurance. Like if you have a party and you have like one of the like a Hoarfrost member in it, that's your tank. They're not going anywhere when the trouble hits the floor. They're going to stand there. They're going to hold their ground. They're never going to move. And that Vesper that goes with their worship and their personality is like part of that system. Same thing where like knowledge, the astrals people, they have like the highest concentration of Vesper. And one of the reasons they have this is because they've actively farmed it. They went out and with their knowledge and their science have like figured out ways to like the most efficient and best way to get Vesper crystals. And that purple is like right in the part of high density, but like not to the point where it's too extreme that it's almost like underwhelming, but it's still volatile. They actually have gotten to a point where like none of their like farmland and everything is just poisoned. It's all been like manipulated to the point where like everybody in the Astral Nations is a little tweaked in the head. They're all going a little bit mad. They're all about like who can have the best spells. We'll talk more about that nation later, but like I said, they're one of those nations where like you go down the road and you'll see crystals like on the side of the road, just like coming up from the ground and condensing onto like objects and the castles and things that have been there for a while. And that's because those people as a nation have come together and like figured out with their knowledge like how to efficiently gather them, and it's messed them up pretty well. So then you have in the middle, you have life and strength. And strength is the protectors of the blade. And they're like right in the middle of these two kind of sides. And basically, you'll find some crystals there. You're going to find them in places of worship, definitely. You're probably not going to see them like out in the middle of these places too much. But you'll definitely find them like around Fogenfinge's Forge, down here, any place that's like seen like a great deal of strength. They're almost seen as like a reward for like achievements of conquest within the society. When you come down to like this area, you'll find crystals, but they'll have to be like places that where like the essence flows to. A lot of the Everfolk nation is all about like encouraging life. So they take care of nature. A lot of the societies have like dire animals that they worship. They keep care of. They're one with nature. And you'll see in these places that like survive and thrive, you'll find green crystals. But for the most part, those crystals are like will congregate more around the plants and the animals themselves, much less the worship of those people. And then like this other one we have is like adventure, and it's kind of like in between life and death, where you're always on the move. You're living life, but you're always seeking out danger also. That's the Wanderers of the Unseen. And they're always on the move, a lot like the Tribes of the Valley. Also have like their own bases almost. Like, you know, they almost each kind of like close-knit family will have a couple ships that move together. Some of them will have like ports. Like you can see a couple the squares on here, the Wanderers of the Unseen ports. And so you'll see that they'll some of them will stay or have like a main port or entry. For the most part, they're always on the move. And just like rivers and the current and waves, they like to travel a lot. But like in these areas where they either come back to a lot, or they do set up like a home that they come back to, and you'll see like crystals kind of start to get dense around there. But for the most part, blue like Vesper stays with the water. So if like a Wanderer of Unseen goes inland and either takes over like a new area or decides to venture in, you'll see the waters rise. And so instead of having like so much of like a crystal, you'll see the waters rise, and the waters is kind of like imbued with that Vesper crystal. So these are, like I said, down here, this is more of like to give you an idea of the different nations that we have and what they like symbolize on the chart. This up top is more what this spectrum is. And you want to like see it as a spectrum, because what happened is like nothing's clear cut in divine intervention. You may have, you know what I mean? Your God may be who you decide to worship, but you might lean towards another religion. So it's definitely more something you want to see as a spectrum. And this is like a terrible spectrum. What you want more is like a color wheel. But even then, it would have to be like some sort of 3D color wheel. Tribes of the Boarhoof is a good kind of like example. It's a tribe of the valley. They worship czars, and that's who they bring back from their hunts, and they sacrifice to them. But they're on like this border of the Everfolk, and so they take on traits from the other folk. The tribe of the Boarhoof, they're this tribe that hunt and dire war pigs. And so they take care of the pigs. They love their pigs. They sacrifice their pigs when they get old. They eat their pigs. They, you know, at the end of the day, they're members of the tribes of the valley, and they worship czars. But they have all these traits from this like constant back and forth from that border. Because sometimes like the Everfolk's territory will come out here, and sometimes the tribes will come down here. Sometimes the tribes will come down here and take over this. And over like those hundreds of years, you start to pick up different influences of different gods. Let's see, another good example would be like the Landlocks. The Landlocks, originally a Wanderers of Unseen tribe or sect that had at some point made its way up through the sunken port, and all this area would have been covered in water. And then over time, like the Hoarfrost nation came down and the czars came over. And so you had this tribe that got landlocked, and they basically are now like in a weird spot where like they've come to worship over the generations Fijat. But they have a lot of like rituals and mentality left over from when they were wanderers of the scene. And I'm talking like hundreds of years. It's not just like, you know, they moved up there and I went, oh, whoop, and like 5 years later they were different. We're talking like as the generations passed on and they grew up there, those new generations kind of fell into the ideology of that god. As Vesper continues to build up like a concentration on the things around it, whether it be its surroundings or its worshippers or the wildlife in the area, that's when you start to get that high level of Vesper essence, and that's how you get magic. Magic is basically an overload of Vesper within an entity. Some nations like the Astral, they're able to like siphon off Vesper essence from their crystals and farm it, and that's why they have the most spell damage. Some nations like the tribes of the valley, they get a lot of their spell power through sacrifice. They sacrifice their gods in their favor. The Vespers surround them. And like I said, it's more of a radiation. So one of the better examples, or well, a clearer example is the Everfolk. They worship a bunch of different gods. The Everfolk are one of the few nations that don't have one main god. They have three major gods, and there's a dispute on who's the actual major god, but almost every society in the Everfolk worships a dire animal, and everything throughout their daily life, or their day, and all their activities surround worshiping these dire animals. And as they care for this life, the Vespers kind of concentrate around them, and they gain magic powers basically from it. Like Everfolk are called Everfolk because they tend to live longer than other people. The dire animals and everything that are in the dire forest of the Everfolk are gigantic. Plants and trees and animals and everything just grow ridiculously large in the dire forest. And that's thanks to that like green Vesper essence that's concentrated in that area because of the worship and the life around it. The same thing kind of goes with like the Hoarfrost Nation. The Vesper essence up there that concentrates around there is what causes the mountains to rise from the ground and the snow to fall throughout the entire year. That probably basically wraps up magic and Vesper essence. It kind of gives you an idea how things work. The hard part about it is each nation has their own way of going about siphoning that Vesper radiation energy into magic. And so it'll be something where we start talking about the individual nations. There'll be a video on just like the magic of the Wanderers of the Unseen. The Wanderers of the Unseen, like I said, they stay with the rivers and in water, and those waters are like irradiated and filled of that Vesper essence. And so where they go, the magic follows them, or sometimes leads them. And they can like come in and flood castles and take them over, and you know have now like a castle that's like half underwater. And so you have like all these different ways of worshiping the gods and the different ways of harnessing the energy off of Vesper. And so, like I said, we'll go more into that individually on its own. This video is more just to kind of like sum up, to kind of give like an understanding of how magic is, because I feel like sometimes it's not explained. It's just kind of like magic, shrug. It works because it's magic. Where like in here, there's a very almost scientific nature to it, where it's almost just like a different kind of light / energy radiation, and as it builds up, that's what gives you the power. That's what makes the Hoarfrost Nation citizens like stronger and have more endurance. It's that Vesper that's instilled with them. It's what makes like the Protectors of the Blade deal more damage in battle because of the red Vesper. It's what makes the Astral Nation more in tune with knowledge and learning. That purple Vesper of Astral. And so I think that wraps up day 2. Thanks for listening.